All right. Begin.
Well, the secretary called me into his office, sat me down, and gave me a cigar. A good cigar.
Oh, that's nice. And then?
He wanted to know if I'd accept a change of assignment. New York.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Austin Whitman, who is the CEO of Climate Neutral, that provides a standard for businesses to become carbon neutral. Thanks for joining today, Austin.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Okay. So what is this notion of corporate carbon responsibility, and how does that fit within a brand CSR strategy?
Corporate carbon responsibility refers to the fact that every corporation in the world, for the most part, contributes to climate change, and yet most sustainability programs don't actually have specific indicators of how a brand or a company is doing on climate change. And so our view is that every company needs to, as a very, very basic first step, understand what its carbon emissions are, not just from its direct operations like the electricity from its office building, but from all of the things that business is responsible for. And then secondly, to actually start to do something about those emissions. And once a company starts to get their head around the contribution that they make to climate change, in most cases, companies are surprised to find that it's as cheap as it is to start to deal with carbon in a meaningful way and become responsible.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that I don't think that enough of the scientific community really reinforces is the value of the economic assessment that you're talking about, that you can actually have a true win-win game scenario. Let's get into your organization, Climate Neutral. What exactly is it, and what is a nonprofit looking to achieve?
We're a nonprofit, as you mentioned, that started about 1.5 years ago, and we launched a label that brands can incorporate into all of their marketing materials, whether it's on their website or on a package. And the label tells consumers that that brand has taken responsibility for their carbon. And we define that again as measuring your carbon emissions, all the carbon it takes to make and deliver products to your consumers, and then has offset the entirety of 1 year of those emissions and made plans to reduce future emissions. And the company has to do this annually so that we track progress on those reduction commitments. And the offsetting that a company has done is never more than a year out of date. So we certified 150 brands in our first year. And we're trying to change a few things about the way this is approached. One, we're trying to greatly simplify the measurement of carbon, which doesn't need to be as complex as it has been historically. Two, we're trying to make it really compelling for consumers, which generally consumers have been left behind, I think, in the climate discussion. Policy is very overwhelming for people to understand, and climate science is very overwhelming. And if we're going to grow a movement to deal with climate change in any sort of reasonable scale, we can't expect that every consumer has to get a PhD in climate science before they're qualified to start doing something about it. So we're trying to make it very understandable, approachable, digestible to the consumer. But then the third point is that we also have to have technical rigor behind this, because we want to be doing something that's meaningful, not greenwashing, but that actually has math and science behind it. And we also need to be connected to all the organizations who are doing the best thinking on climate to make sure that our certification is built on something that's trustworthy.
Yeah, I think certainly the certification from a nonprofit makes sense, but there are actually startups, for-profit startups that's working in this space and quantifying the carbon footprint and getting actually very accurate as well. So why not have a potential for-profit component to your business model?
We certainly could have built aspects of it in a for-profit way. I think our view after talking to dozens and dozens of companies is the quickest path to scale is to reduce barriers. And I'm not in this for the money, nor are our founding funders. I've worked in climate for 15 years, and I'm getting a little impatient at the lack of speed, I guess, in dealing with climate. So yeah, I mean, a company who is considering whether to get on this type of journey, faced with a $20,000 enterprise software license or something that's free, is probably going to say yes to the thing that's free quickly, and much quicker than they can drum up a budget. So I think it would be great if we had a full-blown industry around carbon accounting, because that would be a sign that there is a real commercial driver for companies to do it, but that driver doesn't exist largely because there's no policy for it. So in the absence of that, we're trying to have as low barriers as possible for companies.
Yeah, I think you're right about creating that network effect through essentially an open source consortium model, and having that industry standard is really what's needed. And going back to your early comment that consumers really are trusting that a third party, an independent entity, whether it's yours or something comparable, has placed some sort of a seal that there's been some sort of due diligence that's been performed. I want to get into some definitions. So I think, again, for the listeners who are not as familiar, there is clear differences between net zero, carbon neutral, and carbon negative. Can you briefly describe each of those, and what are you guys looking to achieve through the certification process?
Yeah, it's a complex kind of alphabet soup of definitions. There's carbon negative, there's climate positive, carbon positive, planet positive. We're seeing all kinds of things come out. I think the basic principle is a company measuring its carbon emissions, the carbon emissions that the company is responsible for generating, both directly and indirectly, and are they taking steps to reduce those carbon emissions and finding ways to invest in removing carbon from the global atmosphere that are equivalent to what your emissions are. And it's important to introduce the element of time here, because emissions have to be measured over time to be quantified, and typically a footprint is thought of as 1 year's worth of emissions. So if you take a 2020 emission footprint and it's 10,000 tons of carbon, a company can do very little about emissions that have already happened, and the only way they can claim net zero or neutrality is to invest in carbon removals or carbon offsets or carbon credits, however you want to define them, that are equal to that 10,000 ton footprint. It's too late to reduce those emissions, right? It gets a little trickier when you're talking about positive or negative, because then somebody has to decide, well, is 10,001 tons enough to give you a positive designation, or does that also make you negative? And so we've stuck with neutrality as at least the first version of our certification, because it's a much easier kind of concept. You did this much damage and you did this much positive or you did this much to offset the damage, and so you end up neutral.
Yeah, I think you make a very valid point. Until we get to a point where the industry has a certain time dimension that is, I think everyone follows, and you have clear benchmarks in terms of comparisons, it becomes difficult. Let's get into, the carbon footprint in terms of the category within the scope of 1 to 3 emissions. What is scope 1? What is scope 2? What is scope 3?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, scope 1, 2, and 3 are the language of what's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It was set up a little more than a decade ago as a universal language to describe a company's carbon emissions, and it all relates to the entity that you're creating a carbon footprint for. So the probably the easiest way to explain it is actually to look at to take an imaginary household, because an imaginary household has scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And scope 1 emissions, when your furnace is running in the wintertime and you're burning natural gas in that furnace, there are emissions coming out of your house. And those are scope 1 emissions. So scope 1 emissions, in the case of a company, same exact principle. Somewhere in that company's property, there's a smokestack, there are emissions coming out, and those are direct emissions. Scope 2 emissions are indirect. Going back to the household, if I switch the lights on, I'm using energy, but that electricity is generated 50, 100 miles away at a power plant. I'm responsible for those emissions at the power plant because I'm using the electricity, but the emissions are somewhere else. It's the same exact thing for a company. Again, the company uses electricity, it's generated somewhere else. Those emissions are scope 2. Scope 3 is where it gets really tricky because those are all the emissions that are tied up in the things that we consume. So as a household, all of the food that I eat has carbon emissions that were generated to grow the food and to ship it and to package it. And as a company, all the raw materials that I purchased to make a cell phone or to make a pair of hiking boots, those raw materials created fossil fuel-based emissions, created methane emissions, created all kinds of greenhouse gas emissions in the course of production that are all, think of it as sort of a carbon trail that's a part of that product. That also includes commuting to offices. It includes business travel. It includes emissions from waste. So there's a whole lot of things tied up into scope 3. But that's generally the way to think about those 3 types of emissions.
And the reason I bring it up is as we get into what is your BE calculator, and how it's able to accurately measure the corporate carbon footprints, including scope 1 through 3 emissions, it really kind of begs a big question in terms of how do you quantify that, especially given the definition of scope 3 as an example.
Yeah, I would say anyone who says that they can accurately quantify scope 3 emissions is probably not telling you the truth, because it is something that you have to estimate. And that's true whether you're a consultant or whether you're using a piece of software. It's always an estimate because no one in the history of mankind has ever effectively measured all scope 3 emissions directly at the source. So what we do is use a combination of what are called emission factors. Everything, literally tens of thousands of things out there, whether it's a raw material or an industrial process, has an emission factor that has been measured in a primary way somewhere and then extrapolated to other jurisdictions and other processes, so that what you can do is look at a certain thing and say, for every 1 kilogram of that thing, we generated X number of grams of carbon. Or for every 1 time that process was run, we generated X number of grams of carbon. And the carbon footprinting process is simply a combination of taking all the indicators of business activity, combining them with emission factors, and getting carbon as a result. And so it does take a knowledge of what's happening within the business, but it's not something that's so technical, because ultimately it's just a multiplication problem. Activities times emission factors equals carbon. So that's what we've tried to simplify in the tool that we've built. And it's working pretty well. We're getting some good feedback on it from users, and our hope is that we can even further simplify this so that really any corporate sustainability professional or operations person can use it as a way of estimating their emissions.
Yeah, so again, kind of going back to the very earlier part of the conversation, is that you want, if the goal is to support industry-wide adoption, and you reduce or eliminate the barriers of entry as much as possible, because ultimately we want the more brands and corporations and even public sector start to become certified, that's going to have a huge impact in terms of our ability to mitigate climate change net effects. So I think that's terrific. I do want to go back to this notion of carbon accounting, as well as this the metaphor that I would use is that Linux projects oftentimes host open source projects. And what's very interesting about open source doesn't mean that it's actually free, but it's really about broad-based adoption. But once that adoption is in place, many times there's actually proprietary layers that gets added on and becomes a product or a company that actually sometimes even go IPO actually. That's very much true. So I foresee that as adoption increases And certainly, speaking with, for example, the chief thought leader officer at the IFC World Bank, and how they're pushing some of the operating principles down to some of their signatories to use large asset managers effectively. ESG is becoming very, very important, and I think there's more interest around impact accounting. So it's not just yes or no binary or or negative filter, but they really want to get down to quantitative scorecard. So to that end, your methodology, as it gets more mature, could it in fact theoretically get embedded into, let's say, a cloud-based ERP system? And so that ERP system is going to really know the ins and outs of an organization, from input, supply chain, from manufacturing to the distribution, all of it. You can get a really full assessment so that you can start to really quantify the true cost of what's happening. And in turn, the value, of course, is the data, the accuracy and the data, and then, of course, the seal and the certification mark that comes with that. Does any of this make sense? I mean, what do you think?
Makes perfect sense. And my hope is that in 5 years or 8 years, we'll look back at the way we're doing our carbon accounting today and laugh at it, because it was just so primitive and just so basic. But the unfortunate reality is it's where we are today, and we've got to start there. We've got to start with people chasing utility bills around in their organization. You'd be amazed at how few companies can actually tell you what their electricity bill was for last month. And that's where we're starting, right? I mean, the vision that you paint is beautiful because it basically says, look, we all have all these technology backbones that companies depend on for resource planning and investment and purchasing and inventory management and what have you. Couldn't we plug into those and actually use those to get data that drives carbon accounting? I mean, yes, absolutely, 100%. And it's funny when you mentioned open source, because we're in the process of scoping out a launch of some of our software tool into the open source developer community with exactly this point in mind, that we can have open source contributors build integration points into corporate systems so that we can start to get data from an individual user authorizing access to, say, an Expensify account system. And that's the only way that we'll be able to get data from so many different sources and make this process more achievable. So as I say, 5-10 years from now, I hope we look back and say, man, what we did back then was so ridiculously simple, but everyone's got to pass through preschool to get to college, I guess. So that's where we are.
Well, I'm shaking my head because I can't get over the fact that some of these companies are still chasing their electricity bills. And yes, I think I did get a free pass through kindergarten. So this is, I applaud the work that you guys are doing, because I think keeping the entry point as low as possible, keeping it as simple as possible, and yet still giving a sense of assurance. And I think when people feel that the goal is much closer, more attainable, we're more likely to actually adopt that and embrace that. So I think that's from a psychology makes a perfect amount of sense. So with that, I've been joined by Austin Whitman, who is the CEO of Climate Neutral. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Scott. Great conversation.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.